The morning fog clung to the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, masking the distant roar of the Pacific waves. Japanese soldiers crouched in their bunkers, eyes fixed on the horizon, awaiting the expected artillery barrage. But what emerged from the mist was beyond any calculation, any expectation, any horror they had been trained to anticipate. From the shoreline, armored silhouettes appeared, moving with a precision that seemed unnatural. The flamethrower tanks, their barrels spitting fire, advanced relentlessly across the sand. Walls of flames surged over trenches, pillboxes, and defensive positions, consuming everything in their path. Soldiers froze, their hearts pounding, unable to reconcile what they saw with the world they had known. The first wave of fire leaped from the tanks, licking at the earth, scorching the wooden fortifications and the debris-strewn beaches. The smell of burning timber and smoke filled the air, suffocating in its intensity. Even the most hardened veterans felt the primal fear of being trapped in a living inferno. They had prepared for shells, for machine gun fire, for naval bombardments, but this was different. This was fire made into a weapon, a force of nature twisted by steel and human ingenuity. One soldier, a young conscript from Kyushu, tried to aim his rifle at the advancing tanks, but the flames surged forward faster than he could comprehend. His comrades shouted orders, but the voice of reason was drowned in the crackling heat and the roar of destruction. Some soldiers turned and ran, seeking tunnels or sandbags that could no longer protect them. Others froze, paralyzed by disbelief, their training rendered useless against the unstoppable advance of molten fire. Rumors flew as fast as the flames themselves. Soldiers whispered that these tanks were powered by some secret fuel, stolen from Germany or created in a hidden laboratory on American soil. One claimed they had seen a tank spew fire hundreds of meters farther than physics should allow. Another swore that the fuel could burn underwater, a fantastical exaggeration born of terror and awe. The absurdity of these claims mattered little. They were born of fear, a desperate attempt to rationalize what seemed impossible. And yet, amid the chaos, some soldiers noticed something else. The tanks moved with eerie precision. They avoided unnecessary destruction of terrain that might slow them, targeting fortifications and firing over obstacles as if guided by an invisible hand. The combination of firepower, armor, and strategy was unlike anything they had ever faced. From the rear lines, Japanese officers shouted orders, trying to rally the men. But discipline faltered under the weight of the flames. Soldiers abandoned their posts, some falling into craters or sand-filled trenches to escape the heat. Those who remained attempted counterattacks, firing mortars and rifles at tanks that seemed impervious to damage. Many believed the tanks were invincible, powered by technology beyond comprehension. "It is impossible," one whispered to another, voice trembling. "No weapon should move like that, no fire should burn so fast. We are doomed." Yet they could do nothing but witness the destruction and pray. The fire spread quickly, reaching ammunition depots and smaller defensive positions. Explosions punctuated the roar, sending plumes of black smoke into the sky. Soldiers who survived the initial waves found themselves trapped between the advancing flames and the chaos behind them. Every decision carried a weight they had never known, every hesitation a potential death sentence. And in that moment of terror, a quiet truth settled among the survivors. Their training, their pride, their ideology, none of it could save them from this inferno. The tanks had redefined the battlefield. What had been static defenses, carefully planned positions, and disciplined ranks now appeared fragile, hopelessly vulnerable, and entirely mortal. Dear viewer, ask yourself this: if you were crouched in a bunker, watching fire consume everything you had built, would you fight, or would you flee? Would you cling to pride, or accept survival at any cost? Every second mattered. Every hesitation was a choice between life and death. And for the men facing the flamethrower tanks, the answer was terrifyingly clear: the enemy held the power of fire itself. Some soldiers managed to scramble to nearby caves or tunnels, seeking protection from the relentless heat. Others hid in craters, their hands shielding their faces from the smoke. Every movement, every breath, carried the sharp sting of heat and fear. And even in hiding, they could not escape the horror unfolding before them, their defenses destroyed, comrades wounded or dying, and the relentless advance of fire that obeyed no logic but its own. It was in these first moments that disbelief became the enemy's most effective weapon. The Japanese soldiers could not comprehend how a single machine could instill both terror and hopelessness so efficiently. They had expected artillery, naval guns, perhaps even chemical weapons. But flamethrower tanks? They were something else entirely, a living, burning manifestation of war itself. Some whispered that this was a trick, that the tanks were illusions, designed to break morale without real damage. Others claimed that the Americans had supernatural assistance, a rumor reflecting desperation and fear. Even as flames licked the edges of bunkers, soldiers' minds clung to these impossibilities, unwilling to accept the stark truth: fire, human-made, relentless, and precise, was tearing through their positions. The morning's fog had barely lifted when the flamethrower tanks surged forward, engines roaring, fire spewing across the volcanic sands. Japanese soldiers scrambled, shouting orders that went unheard over the roar of the tanks and the crackle of fire. The first strike was absolute. Trenches were engulfed, wooden bunkers splintered, and the smell of scorched earth and smoke filled the air. For the soldiers entrenched along the ridges, disbelief turned to terror. The tanks moved like beasts with steel skins, impervious to small arms fire. Even heavy artillery seemed barely to scratch them. The flames surged over sandbags and obstacles, consuming everything in their path. Japanese defenders tried to retreat, but every movement carried risk. One misstep could mean instant death, and there was nowhere to hide from the searing heat. The chaos was immediate. Mortars fired, rifles cracked, yet the tanks advanced steadily, spraying molten streams that devoured defensive positions with terrifying precision. Some soldiers froze, watching comrades burned or driven from bunkers. Others attempted to fight back, throwing grenades and firing into the tanks, but the armored beasts shrugged off their attacks. Rumors spread faster than the flames. Soldiers whispered that the tank's fuel was unlike anything made in Japan, a secret American formula capable of burning endlessly. One claimed the tanks could even burn underwater, a scientific impossibility, but believable in the haze of fear and confusion. Another insisted the tanks were powered remotely from aircraft, an absurd exaggeration reflecting the soldiers' inability to understand the technology before them. Amid the inferno, officers tried to rally their men. Commands were shouted, strategies recalculated, but discipline faltered as smoke, fire, and explosions dominated every sense. Soldiers abandoned positions, falling into craters or the shallow trenches that could no longer offer protection. Panic spread faster than any flame. One young conscript, barely 19, froze mid-step as a tank barrel unleashed another torrent of fire near his bunker. He had been trained for war, for discipline, for honor, but nothing had prepared him for this. The fire was indiscriminate, consuming cover and comrades alike. He ducked, heart hammering, praying for a miracle. Even those who tried to hold their ground were met with futility. Trenches that had been meticulously dug, fortifications reinforced over months, were incinerated within minutes. The tanks advanced with mechanical precision, obliterating defenses that had seemed impregnable. Many soldiers could not understand how a single machine, or even a platoon of them, could achieve so much destruction. "It is impossible," one whispered to another, eyes wide with terror. "No weapon should move like that. No fire should consume everything so quickly." Yet the flames proved it was possible. The sheer destructive power of the flamethrower tanks left no room for doubt. Amid the chaos, small acts of desperation appeared. Soldiers tried to lure tanks into traps, to ambush them with artillery or mines, but the tanks adapted, moving over obstacles and adjusting positions with unnerving awareness. One soldier claimed, wildly, that the tank's targeting systems were guided by invisible sensors capable of detecting heartbeats, an exaggeration reflecting fear and confusion. And yet, despite the panic and destruction, a harsh clarity emerged. the battle had changed. Tactics, bravery, and discipline were no longer sufficient. Survival depended on adaptability, on speed, and often, on sheer luck. Soldiers who had relied on traditional defensive strategies found themselves overwhelmed, powerless against the unrelenting flames. Dear viewer, pause for a moment. If everything you had built to protect yourself was consumed in minutes, would you continue to fight, or surrender to the fear? Would pride blind you to survival? The Japanese soldiers faced this choice every second as the tanks advanced, every decision carrying the weight of life or death. Amid the burning bunkers and shattered defenses, whispers spread among the surviving soldiers. Some muttered that the flamethrower tanks were too advanced to be real, that the Americans must have stolen secret designs from Germany. Others believed the tanks could burn endlessly, feeding off an impossible fuel supply. None of these claims were true, but the terror they felt made any explanation plausible. By the end of the first strike, the battlefield was transformed. Trenches once defended with rigid discipline were flattened. Defensive positions smoldered, the scent of fire clinging to every corner. Survivors crawled from bunkers, faces streaked with soot and sweat, eyes wide in shock. The flamethrower tanks had not just destroyed positions, they had shattered morale. For the soldiers, reality was undeniable. They had underestimated the enemy, and now fire, metal, and innovation ruled the battlefield. Smoke rose in thick plumes from the shattered bunkers, mingling with the acrid stench of scorched sand and burning wood. Japanese soldiers, once confident in their defensive positions, were now scrambling amid chaos they could not control. The flamethrower tanks moved with unrelenting precision, leaving fire and destruction in their wake. The battlefield was no longer organized. Craters and collapsed fortifications littered the sand, and communication between units had broken down. Officers shouted orders, but their voices were drowned in the roar of flames and the clatter of collapsing structures. Soldiers fired blindly, desperately trying to slow the advance, but every trench, every barricade, was neutralized within moments. Panic spread faster than fire. Men stumbled over debris, some falling into sand-filled trenches while others sought cover behind rocks that offered little protection. The younger soldiers, many inexperienced and terrified, could not comprehend the scale of destruction. Their hearts pounded as they witnessed comrades consumed by flames or thrown aside by explosions. Amid the chaos, rumors and mistakes flourished. Soldiers whispered that the flamethrower tanks were powered by secret fuel stolen from Germany, or that they could burn for hours without refueling, claims that were physically impossible but believable under the stress of survival. Others insisted that the tanks were guided remotely by Americans in planes, an absurd exaggeration that reflected their fear and disbelief. Some tried to coordinate counterattacks, firing mortars or grenades at the armored beasts. A few even attempted to disable the tanks with mines, but the tanks adapted with horrifying efficiency, their crews seemingly anticipating every move. One soldier claimed that the tank's fire could melt steel instantly, a mistaken observation fueled by smoke, panic, and terror. Every second carried a choice between life and death. Soldiers debated whether to stay and fight or flee to the tunnels and caves that offered scant protection. Pride clashed with fear. Discipline faltered as men realized that the enemy's weapons were unlike anything they had trained to face. Each second of hesitation could be fatal. In the midst of the inferno, small acts of courage appeared. One soldier ran through the smoke to drag a wounded comrade into cover, ignoring the intense heat and the roar of advancing fire. Another shouted warnings to nearby units, attempting to prevent further casualties. Yet for every act of bravery, there were countless moments of paralysis, of men frozen in disbelief as the flamethrower tanks consumed everything they had prepared to defend. The visual impact was staggering. Bunkers burned, sand exploded into the air from tank fire, and smoke obscured even the nearest enemies. Soldiers struggled to breathe, coughing from the thick, acrid air. It was not just a battle, it was a trial by fire, one that tested courage, instinct, and survival in equal measure. Rumors spread quickly among the surviving soldiers. Some whispered that the tanks were equipped with invisible shields that made them impervious to bullets. Others claimed that the flames could somehow penetrate tunnels, an impossibility, yet a belief born from terror. Even mistakes and exaggerations reflected the psychological strain of witnessing technology they could not comprehend. Amid the smoke and chaos, a few soldiers found moments of grim clarity. They realized that survival depended not on pride, ideology, or loyalty, but on adaptability and quick thinking. Decisions had to be made in fractions of seconds: flee, hide, or face the fire with what courage remained. Each choice carried consequences beyond their understanding. Dear viewer, pause and consider: if you were trapped amid flames, with chaos all around and the rules of battle rewritten by a machine, would you have acted, or frozen? Could you survive when every instinct screamed surrender? The Japanese soldiers faced this daily, every step a gamble, every heartbeat a test of endurance. By the end of the strike, smoke blanketed the battlefield. Trenches and bunkers that had been meticulously constructed were reduced to smoldering remnants. Survivors staggered through ash and debris, hearts pounding, minds reeling. The flamethrower tanks had not just destroyed positions, they had shattered morale, instilled fear, and rewritten the rules of engagement in ways soldiers could hardly grasp. Even as they sought shelter, the paradox haunted them: the enemy was not just powerful, it was precise, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. The tanks had introduced a new form of warfare, one that demanded more than courage or discipline. It demanded psychological resilience, an understanding of fear, and the willingness to face destruction beyond comprehension. Some soldiers whispered about the impossibility of the event, claiming the tanks were supernaturally enhanced, fueled by invisible reserves of flame. Others insisted that American engineers had devised these machines to terrorize soldiers into submission. All of it was false, but in that haze of terror, every explanation, however impossible, seemed plausible. Amid the smoke, one realization became painfully clear: survival was no longer just about skill or strategy. It was about adapting to a force that defied understanding, acknowledging the terror, and making choices that could mean life or death. The volcanic sand beneath their feet trembled as the flamethrower tanks advanced. Japanese soldiers crouched in shattered bunkers and jagged craters, hearts hammering. Every crackle of fire, every roar of the engines, was a reminder that the battlefield had changed. This was no ordinary attack. This was a new form of warfare, one that seemed almost supernatural in its efficiency. Some soldiers stared at the tanks in frozen disbelief. They had trained for artillery bombardments, strafing runs, and naval shelling, but nothing could prepare them for fire projected with surgical precision. The flames licked the edges of bunkers, consuming barricades with terrifying speed. Dust, smoke, and heat swirled around them, making the air almost impossible to breathe. A young conscript from Osaka whispered to his neighbor, voice trembling, "It's like the fire has a mind of its own. It knows where we are." His companion could only nod, eyes wide in terror. Even the veterans, hardened by years of battle, felt the weight of a fear they had never encountered. Their training, their experience, their discipline, all seemed insignificant against the raw, unrelenting power of the flamethrower tanks. Amid the chaos, misinformation flourished. Some soldiers believed the tanks were powered by a secret fuel, created in laboratories hidden deep within the United States. Others claimed that the flamethrowers could burn endlessly without refueling, a fantastical exaggeration born of panic. One veteran insisted the tanks were guided remotely from high-flying aircraft, a notion both impossible and terrifying to consider. These mistakes, though false, reflected the soldiers' desperate attempt to rationalize the horror before them. The psychological toll was immediate. Fear gripped soldiers in ways that bullets never had. They shook uncontrollably, their minds cycling through panic, disbelief, and the faint hope that the tanks might somehow miss them. Some tried to aim their rifles at the advancing machines, but instinct and terror betrayed them. The weapons felt useless against armor and fire, and the futility of resistance sank into their bones. Orders were shouted, officers tried to rally their men, but clarity dissolved in the haze of heat and smoke. Soldiers scrambled for cover, sometimes diving into trenches already ablaze, others pressing against walls that would soon collapse. The battlefield was a blur of movement and sound, an inferno that demanded attention, reaction, and courage beyond reason. Even those who had survived previous battles found themselves questioning reality. One Japanese sergeant claimed the tank's flames were so intense they could ignite sand, a physical impossibility, yet in that haze of terror, it seemed plausible. Another whispered that American engineers had devised the tanks to operate underwater, a fanciful mistake reflecting their disbelief and the desire to explain the unexplainable. The fear was compounded by the unexpected precision of the tanks. They did not advance blindly. They avoided unnecessary obstacles, targeted defensive positions with ruthless accuracy, and created corridors of fire that cut off escape. Soldiers realized that survival required more than bravery, it required calculation, adaptability, and the terrifying acceptance that the rules of combat had shifted. In the midst of this, moments of humanity flickered. Some soldiers observed wounded comrades being pulled from the flames by others, the stark courage and desperation evident in every action. Others noticed the way the tanks avoided unnecessary collateral damage in certain areas, creating a strange paradox, destruction and mercy coexisting on the battlefield. It was a concept that their indoctrinated minds could hardly process. Dear viewer, pause and ask yourself, if you were forced to face an unstoppable force, one that redefined everything you knew about combat, would you freeze, or act? Could you survive when the world around you seemed designed to incinerate every ounce of certainty? Even as the battle raged, a subtle realization began to form among the soldiers: fear could be a teacher. It revealed the limitations of training, the fragility of fortifications, and the necessity of adaptability. Pride and ideology were secondary to survival. Every heartbeat became a measure of life or death, every decision a choice between action and annihilation. By the end of the day, trenches had been destroyed, barricades obliterated, and morale shattered. Survivors huddled together, breathing heavily, trying to comprehend the firestorm they had faced. The flamethrower tanks had not only destroyed defenses, they had inflicted a psychological wound, planting seeds of doubt, disbelief, and awe that would persist long after the battle ended. Even as soldiers clung to life, the paradox lingered: the enemy was simultaneously destroyer and arbiter of survival, a force beyond their comprehension. The fear and disbelief would haunt them, shaping every memory, every story, and every reflection in the years to come. The volcanic sands of Iwo Jima shook beneath the relentless roar of the flamethrower tanks. Japanese soldiers, though battered and terrified, attempted to regroup, desperately trying to mount a counterattack. Morale was fragile, and yet the instinct to fight, to resist annihilation, burned stubbornly in the hearts of the defenders. Trenches had been flattened, pillboxes incinerated, and bunkers reduced to smoldering ruins. Yet officers shouted orders, attempting to rally their men, to organize resistance against the inferno advancing with unstoppable precision. Soldiers scrambled to gather mortars, grenades, and rifles, forming hastily arranged lines of defense. But the tanks advanced with calculated efficiency, neutralizing every effort before it could take effect. Some soldiers fired blindly, aiming at the tanks, hoping sheer volume of bullets would halt them. Others threw grenades into their path, attempting to ignite engines or block tracks. Yet the tanks shrugged off these attacks, their armor impervious, their flames indifferent. The soldiers began to realize that their training, strategies, and courage were insufficient against this unprecedented force. Rumors spread quickly among the ranks. Some soldiers claimed the tank's fire could penetrate underground tunnels, a physical impossibility. Others insisted the fuel was enchanted, capable of burning indefinitely without refilling. One whispered that the tanks were guided by secret American engineers using invisible sensors, an absurd but compelling explanation to a mind struggling to comprehend the devastation. Amid the chaos, individual acts of heroism flickered briefly. One soldier charged a tank with a flamethrower of his own, attempting to ignite its fuel lines. Another dragged a wounded comrade to relative safety behind a collapsed bunker. These acts, while courageous, were isolated, often futile, swallowed quickly by the overwhelming advance of fire and metal. The casualties mounted rapidly. Trenches, once filled with disciplined soldiers, were emptied by fire and smoke. Men fell where they stood, consumed by flames or buried beneath collapsing bunkers. The survivors stumbled, disoriented, coughing in smoke-filled air, struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of destruction surrounding them. Even the officers who attempted to coordinate the defense found their authority undermined by the relentless tanks. Orders became frantic, shouted over the roar of engines and the crackle of flames, often unheard by the men below. Soldiers acted independently, some fleeing, others freezing in place, and a few attempting desperate last-minute counterattacks that ended in failure. Among the surviving soldiers, fear and disbelief clashed with duty and honor. Pride demanded that they fight, but survival instincts whispered to flee. Some men abandoned positions, seeking shelter in craters or small caves that offered scant protection. Others charged forward, determined to resist despite the overwhelming odds. Every choice carried the weight of life and death. Mistakes in perception compounded the terror. Soldiers swore the tank's flames could melt steel instantly or that the engines ran on some unknown, supernatural fuel. One claimed the tanks were designed to operate underwater, another that they were invincible because of secret alloys unknown to the Japanese army. None of these were true, but under the stress of fear and chaos, they became plausible explanations. By midday, the battlefield had been transformed into a landscape of ruin. Trenches were leveled, fortifications burned, and the sand itself bore the black scars of fire. Casualties were staggering. Survivors huddled behind debris, their faces streaked with soot and sweat, eyes wide with disbelief at what had transpired. And yet, amid the devastation, a grim clarity emerged. Survival was not determined by courage alone. Adaptation, quick thinking, and sometimes sheer luck were the only tools that could preserve life in the face of such overwhelming firepower. The tanks had rewritten the rules of battle. Strategies that had worked for months, even years, were rendered meaningless. The soldiers' pride and training offered little protection against this new form of warfare. Dear viewer, pause for a moment. If your comrades were falling around you, your defenses annihilated, and every strategy failing, would you continue to fight, or would fear drive you to flee? Could you survive when every decision carries the weight of life and death? Every heartbeat mattered. Every choice determined whether a soldier would live or become another victim of the unstoppable firestorm. By the end of the counterattack, the Japanese soldiers were exhausted, traumatized, and demoralized. What had begun as organized defense had collapsed into chaos and desperation. The flamethrower tanks had achieved not just physical destruction, they had shattered morale, instilled paralyzing fear, and forced soldiers to confront the limits of their courage. Even in retreat, the paradox lingered. The tanks were not just machines of death, they were teachers of reality, demonstrating the brutal efficiency of American engineering, firepower, and psychological dominance. Every soldier who survived carried a mental scar far deeper than any burn or wound, a scar of disbelief, fear, and the painful lesson of survival against impossible odds. The battlefield was a hellscape of fire, smoke, and shattered sand. Amid the roar of engines and the relentless crackle of flames, individual soldiers became small islands of desperation, courage, and disbelief. The flamethrower tanks had carved a new reality into the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, but the human stories of survival were equally vivid. One Japanese soldier, barely 20, clutched a rifle and huddled against the scorched wall of a collapsed bunker. He had witnessed comrades burned or incapacitated by the advancing tanks, yet his body refused to obey the instinct to flee. Instead, he remained crouched, trying to suppress the fear that threatened to consume him entirely. Each time a tank sprayed fire across the sand, he flinched, his mind racing through every possible escape route, every calculation of chance. Nearby, another soldier dragged a wounded comrade into a crater, ignoring the searing heat and the roar of flames nearby. The man's uniform was torn, his skin scorched, yet he moved with desperate determination. The act of saving another, amidst impossible odds, became a moment of clarity. Survival was not merely about evading death, it was about preserving life wherever possible, even for those they had once called enemy or traitor. Rumors and mistakes spread even in these moments. Soldiers whispered that some flamethrower tanks could shoot fire hundreds of meters farther than was possible, or that the fuel used could burn underwater. Others claimed the tanks were invincible because of secret alloys forged in hidden American factories. None of this was true, but in the confusion of fear, every explanation that made the impossible seem plausible was welcomed. Despite the overwhelming firepower, small acts of defiance and courage persisted. One veteran leapt from a trench, throwing a grenade at a tank advancing too close, even as the fire leapt past his feet. He fell back into a crater, dazed but alive, and the explosion, though minor, ignited a small diversion. Another soldier risked his life to drag a wounded comrade out of the path of the fire, sweat and blood streaming down his face, his mind focused solely on one thought: survival through solidarity. Amid these acts, the soldiers' emotions were raw and unfiltered. Grief for fallen comrades mingled with fear, awe at the sheer power of the tanks, and a strange sense of admiration for the precision and engineering behind the enemy's machines. They had been trained to hate, taught to fear, and yet, the reality of survival forced them to reckon with conflicting feelings: respect for efficiency, awe at the technology, and shock at the relentless nature of the assault. The battlefield became a crucible of human emotion. Soldiers whispered prayers, offered quiet encouragement, and sometimes simply froze, watching the fire advance, unable to comprehend the sheer destruction. Even the youngest conscripts, overwhelmed by fear, displayed moments of instinctive courage, guiding comrades to cover, dragging the wounded from trenches, or standing briefly to fire back at tanks before diving for safety. Mistakes and exaggerations persisted in these stories. One soldier claimed that the tanks could melt steel doors instantly or that they had fuel that never ran out. Another swore that the fire could seep through the sand, reaching soldiers in hiding, an impossibility, yet believable to those experiencing terror firsthand. These false beliefs, though technically incorrect, captured the psychological weight of facing something incomprehensible. Dear viewer, pause for a moment and ask yourself, if you were crouched in the sand, watching fire consume everything, could you risk your life to save another? Could you act with courage when every instinct screamed survival? Every movement, every decision, was a test of moral strength as well as physical endurance. Even as the tanks moved forward, the human stories of fire persisted. Soldiers huddled together, whispered encouragement, and sometimes shared quiet moments of laughter or disbelief in the midst of chaos. It was in these moments, small, fleeting, human, that resilience became visible. Survival was no longer merely about evading flames, it was about finding humanity amid destruction, about choosing courage when everything suggested despair. By the end of the day, the battlefield was scarred and blackened, littered with debris and the remnants of defensive positions. Yet the human stories, acts of bravery, desperation, and fleeting hope, remained. Soldiers carried these moments in their minds as both memory and lesson, that even amid unimaginable destruction, the human spirit could assert itself, however briefly. The flamethrower tanks had dominated the battlefield, rewriting the rules of war, but they could not extinguish courage, ingenuity, or the desperate bonds formed in fire. The paradox remained: destruction and heroism coexisted, and the soldiers who survived would carry both the horror and the stories of bravery for the rest of their lives. The sun sank behind the jagged volcanic ridges of Iwo Jima, casting long shadows over a battlefield that had been reduced to ash and ruin. For the survivors of the flamethrower tank assault, the day's terror lingered like smoke in their lungs. Trenches were flattened, fortifications destroyed, and scorched sand marked the path of unstoppable fire. Yet even amid destruction, the human cost and the lessons learned weighed heaviest on the minds of the soldiers. Japanese troops crawled from the debris, faces streaked with soot, sweat, and exhaustion. Some wept quietly, overwhelmed by disbelief and grief. Others stood silently, staring at the smoldering remains of their bunkers, trying to reconcile what they had witnessed with everything they had been taught about war and the enemy. The flamethrower tanks had done more than destroy positions, they had shattered certainty, discipline, and long-held beliefs. Many soldiers reflected on the acts of courage they had witnessed, or committed themselves. A young conscript remembered dragging a wounded comrade to safety under the roar of flames. A veteran recalled a brief diversion created by a hastily thrown grenade that distracted a tank long enough to save lives. In the midst of devastation, these small stories of bravery had endured, proof that human will could persist even when facing a seemingly unstoppable force. Rumors and mistakes persisted in memory. Some soldiers insisted the tanks could incinerate entire bunkers in a single blast. Others claimed that the fuel used was a secret American formula capable of burning endlessly. One even swore that a tank's flames could travel over water to reach those hiding in caves, a physical impossibility. These exaggerations reflected the soldiers' ongoing struggle to make sense of the overwhelming events, to reconcile terror with understanding. Even as they surveyed the battlefield, survivors began to notice subtle truths. The tanks had destroyed their defenses with precision, but not indiscriminately. Some areas were left intact, not out of mercy, but because strategy dictated efficiency. Soldiers began to understand that the American advance was a combination of engineering, firepower, and psychological mastery. It was a lesson in survival under conditions they had never imagined. The psychological scars were deep. Fear had dominated every heartbeat. Disbelief had frozen muscles and minds alike. Yet amid the terror, a strange sense of awe emerged. The tanks, terrifying as they were, had forced the soldiers to confront the limits of their courage, their pride, and their understanding of warfare. They had survived because they had endured not only fire, but the moral and mental pressure of facing the seemingly impossible. Some survivors carried guilt. Could they have done more? Should they have acted differently? Could they have helped comrades who did not survive? Even those who had fought valiantly felt the weight of helplessness. The fire had consumed everything they had relied on, their bunkers, their plans, their sense of control. And yet, they had lived. Survival had come at the cost of certainty, pride, and the illusion of invincibility. The survivors also carried the memory of the absurd, impossible explanations that had floated through their minds during the attack. They had believed tanks could operate underwater, that the flames could burn indefinitely, that invisible sensors guided every movement. These mistakes were false, yet they revealed the human need to rationalize the incomprehensible, to find logic in a reality that defied understanding. Dear viewer, pause and ask yourself, if you had lived through fire, destruction, and overwhelming odds, could you carry the memory without being haunted? Could you reconcile survival with the reality of fear and loss? Every heartbeat, every decision, every act of courage had shaped the men who lived through the inferno. In the weeks that followed, survivors rebuilt what they could. They cleared debris, patched trenches, and attempted to re-establish defensive positions. But the lessons of the day lingered more than the physical reconstruction. Soldiers shared stories quietly, recounting moments of fear, awe, and bravery. They spoke of the tank's power, the fire, and the strange combination of terror and respect it inspired. Even decades later, the memory persisted. Veterans recounted the events not only to remember, but to teach the lessons of courage, adaptability, and human endurance. They spoke of the flamethrower tanks as instruments of destruction, but also as teachers of survival, showing that fear could be faced, strategies could fail, and yet life could be preserved through courage and quick thinking. Some remembered the exaggerations, the tanks that burned endlessly, that could melt steel, that operated underwater, not as truths, but as reminders of the psychological strain of war. They were artifacts of disbelief, capturing the mental and emotional challenges faced by soldiers confronting an enemy unlike any they had imagined. For the survivors, the battle had reshaped their understanding of war, technology, and human resilience. The flamethrower tanks had dominated the battlefield, but they had also exposed the limits of indoctrination, pride, and fear. Soldiers had survived not only through skill and training, but by confronting terror, embracing adaptability, and witnessing the devastating efficiency of their enemy. And here, dear viewer, consider this final question: if you had survived the fire, the destruction, and the impossible, could you carry the memory without letting it haunt you? Would you honor the courage it took to live, or let fear define your life forever? Every survivor carried this lesson, the enduring paradox of fear and survival, destruction and courage, horror and human endurance. The volcanic sands of Iwo Jima had been scorched, the bunkers destroyed, the soldiers tested beyond measure. But for those who lived, the legacy of the flamethrower tanks endured, not just as weapons of war, but as unforgettable teachers of resilience, courage, and the terrifying cost of survival.